You picture it first as something mundane, almost laughably trivial. A middle-aged man crouching in the supermarket aisles of Mazan, south of France, fiddling with his phone, trying to film beneath women's skirts. The kind of petty voyeurism that gets whispered about but rarely lands on front pages. Yet, on that September day in 2020, when security stopped 55-year-old Dominique Pellicot, they had no idea they were tugging at the loose thread of one of France's most monstrous scandals. A nation would later call it the Pellicot case, shorthand for organized abuse on a scale that seemed unthinkable. And you, dear listener, are about to travel into that world. Welcome to 102 Hours, the place where late-night voices untangle the crimes that history almost can't believe. I'm glad you're here, leaning into this dim corner of your evening. Take a slow breath. Maybe sip whatever's on your bedside table. If you're listening in Lyon at 11:42 p.m., or in Montreal at 2:42 in the afternoon, leave your local time in the comments. It's a ritual here, a way of reminding ourselves this story is woven through many time zones, many lives. If you're new, go ahead and tap subscribe. That way you won't miss the next whispered descent into the archives of justice and outrage. Tonight, the echo is Mazan. The thread is one man's supermarket arrest. The unraveling reveals something much, much darker. The first jolt was procedural. When police seized Pellicot's phone, they expected at worst a cache of voyeuristic photos. Instead, forensic techs scrolling through his devices stumbled upon carefully labeled folders. Inside, videos of his wife, unconscious, assaulted by men who seemed to rotate in and out like members of some macabre club. For weeks, investigators debated whether they were even seeing what they thought they were seeing. Could a husband really drug his wife for nearly a decade, then invite dozens of strangers from the internet to violate her body while he filmed? Investigators still question whether anyone could have imagined such sustained cruelty without proof. Historically, Mazan is not the place you expect to host headlines. It's a quiet, Vaucluse commune surrounded by vineyards and lavender fields, better known for its wine than for its crime blotter. The town's claim to fame before this was that the notorious Marquis de Sade once lived nearby. A historical tidbit suddenly feels grimly ironic. The echoes of hidden chambers, the whispers of abuses tolerated too long. Now, 3 centuries later, Mazan is again linked to abuse. But this time, no one is romanticizing the cruelty. As officers dug deeper, they mapped a pattern stretching back to 2011. Almost ritualistic. Dominique would drug his wife Giselle, arrange meetings through an online forum, and bring strangers into their home. The numbers became staggering. 92 separate assaults documented involving 72 different men. Many of those men claimed later they believed she was a willing participant, an excuse investigators treated with weary suspicion. Still, the case raised an uncomfortable fringe question. In a digital world where sleeping role-play videos are disturbingly common, how many perpetrators convinced themselves fiction was real? The police station in Carpentras soon became ground zero for this nightmare. Officers faced hard drives filled with evidence, enough to overwhelm even seasoned investigators. Some described it like discovering an iceberg. They had arrested a voyeur in a supermarket and instead uncovered the tip of organized systemic abuse. And just like with the Titanic, the nation realized too late how massive the structure below really was. At first, local press tiptoed around the details. But once the scale emerged, France's major outlets descended on Mazan. Headlines called it L'Affaire Pellicot. Talk shows debated how such horrors could persist in a marriage, in a neighborhood, in a society supposedly built on vigilance. Was it denial? Was it cowardice? Investigators still question whether neighbors, friends, or even extended family had inklings that something was very wrong behind those shutters. You think of Giselle herself during those years. Unaware, chemically subdued, her life essentially stolen from her in fragments she never lived. When police finally told her, when they laid out what they'd found, she was faced with the terrifying prospect of remembering without memory. A paradox, to be a victim of nearly a decade of organized rape, yet to hold no conscious recollection of the assaults. Forensic evidence said one thing, her lived awareness said another. That chasm between fact and experience became one of the most haunting aspects of the case. The quirks of fate here are brutal. If Dominique had not been such a clumsy voyeur, if he had not been caught angling his phone beneath a stranger's skirt in that Mazan supermarket, the abuse might have gone on indefinitely. History sometimes hinges on accidents. A misstep, a glance from a security guard, the split-second decision to detain instead of warn. It calls to mind other turning points, like how a petty burglary once led police to stumble on the Watergate scandal. Small crimes can be doors to much larger truths. By late 2020, whispers had spread across Mazan. Residents struggled with disbelief. Could their neighbor, the man walking his dog, really be at the center of France's most grotesque abuse ring? For some, it was easier to dismiss it as sensational reporting. For others, the horror lay in recognizing how ordinary Dominique seemed. The ordinariness was the camouflage. The ordinariness was the danger. And so the story of the Pellicot case begins not with a dramatic raid, not with sirens blaring, but with something that seemed trivial, even pathetic. A man with a phone in a supermarket. You find yourself reflecting on that. How often evil doesn't enter the world with a bang, but with a shrug, a sly grin, or a stolen glance down an aisle. And from that starting point, France would be forced to reckon with organized abuse, digital complicity, and the limits of its own vigilance. You picture them first as ordinary. Dominique Pellicot and his wife, Giselle, married in the 1970s, raising children, living in the southern French town of Mazan. From the outside, their story looked unremarkable. Suburban routine, family holidays, the long arc of a marriage extending across decades. That veneer of ordinariness was precisely the shield. Behind it, a horrifying betrayal unfolded, one that would later earn Dominique the reputation as France's most reviled husband. For Giselle, life meant trust. She worked, she raised her children, she hosted dinners. She shared her home with a man she believed was her partner, her confidant. She never knew that for nearly 10 years he was quietly dismantling her autonomy with sleeping pills. Investigators later found traces of benzodiazepines and other sedatives in her system, slipped into her food and drink by the very man she trusted most. He was not simply a husband, he was her captor in plain sight. Dominique, meanwhile, cultivated his image as a kind of family man. He played the role convincingly enough to escape suspicion. Neighbors described him as polite, sometimes quiet, sometimes friendly in the banal ways that make people forget to look deeper. And yet, on the internet, under pseudonyms, he became someone else entirely. A recruiter, a trafficker of access to his unconscious wife. A man who kept meticulous records, photographs, and videos of what he did, and what he invited others to do. Historically, France has seen shocking domestic betrayal cases. In the 19th century, the Affaire Gouffet revolved around a Parisian clerk murdered by his supposed lover and her accomplice, the ordinariness of domestic life concealing horror. Dominique's case feels like the grim digital echo of that older scandal. Once again, behind the curtains of routine, unimaginable cruelty brewed. Investigators still question whether Dominique ever sought psychological help, or if anyone close to him suspected his duplicity. His diaries, fragments recovered from seized drives, suggested he rationalized the assaults as a twisted form of marital control, a fantasy he built into a ritual. He convinced himself he was curating a private world of desire, when in reality he orchestrated mass abuse against a woman incapable of consent. For Giselle, the betrayal landed not just in the body, but in memory itself. She had lost years. Imagine waking up one morning and being told that the person beside you at the breakfast table was your abuser, and that nearly 100 assaults had occurred in your own home without you ever knowing. Survivors often describe trauma as a theft. Here, it was a theft of experience itself, Quirky detail. Dominique was once known locally for his odd hobby, collecting antique cameras. Friends joked about his obsession with lenses, with old-fashioned film reels. No one imagined that the same fixation would morph into a compulsion to record his wife's violation. The eerie crossover between harmless hobby and monstrous crime is a reminder of how blurred lines can become when secrets thrive unchecked. Their marriage, then, becomes the central contradiction of the Pellicott case. Intimacy paired with betrayal. Love weaponized into exploitation. For outsiders, it forced painful questions about trust, about how much one can ever really know of the person they sleep beside. When police told Giselle, she didn't just grieve the assaults she never remembered. She grieved the collapse of decades of partnership. Her husband had not been her ally. He had been her enemy. The betrayal reverberated through their children as well. One daughter, Caroline Darien, would later publicly accuse Dominique of drugging and assaulting her in her own adolescence. Allegations still under investigation. Whether proven or not, the very fact they surfaced underscores how fragile the family fabric had always been. The line between father and predator blurred in ways France struggled to confront. Mazan itself, small and tight-knit, whispered about Giselle with pity, sometimes with cruel curiosity. In rural towns, privacy is sacred, but gossip is inevitable. She became at once the most pitied and the most scrutinized woman in France. A survivor who did not even know she was surviving. A cruel paradox that forced the country to ask whether not knowing was a mercy or an added violation. The ordinariness of Dominique and Giselle's life is what chills you most. Nothing about their home signaled danger. No warning signs glowed neon. Their story reminds you of the unnerving truth. Abuse often hides in plain sight, behind the mask of routine. Investigators still question whether society's obsession with appearances, quiet towns, polite families, makes us blind to danger in our midst. As you lean back now, you feel the weight of that betrayal. A marriage turned into a crime scene, a home into a stage for organized abuse. Dominique and Giselle's story is no longer theirs alone. It has become France's mirror, forcing the nation to see the cracks in trust, the fragility of intimacy, and the ease with which evil can wear the costume of ordinary love. The supermarket arrest was the entry point, but the true machinery of the Pellicott case turned out to be digital. Dominique Pellicot didn't just act alone in the shadows of his own home. He built a network, one that thrived on secrecy, pseudonyms, and shared appetite. And it all pulsed through the glow of an online forum, Coco, FR, an unassuming chat site that became, in prosecutors' words, a hub of organized abuse. You picture Dominique late at night, the rest of his house asleep. He sits at a computer, logging into a chat room with the eerily bland name Ason Insu, without her knowledge. A corner of the internet where strangers traded fantasies about drugging, controlling, and assaulting women. For most, it stayed in the realm of typed words. For Dominique, it became a blueprint. Under pseudonyms, he posted invitations, detailed instructions, sometimes even timetables. The bait was simple. His wife, unconscious, available. Men answered, and he arranged meetings. Investigators later described the chat room as a conveyor belt. One man would message from Lyon, another from Marseille, another from as far as Belgium. They would drive to Mazan, step into the Pellicot house, and within minutes become participants in what prosecutors labeled organized gang rape. The eerie part is how normalized it seemed in those chat logs. Jokes about travel, casual language about availability. Almost like ordering food delivery, except the subject was a drugged woman in her 50s. Historically, France has wrestled with the darker edges of the internet before. In the early 2000s, police cracked down on Skyrock groups where predators used blogs to target minors. The Pellicott case is the grim sequel, but worse. Not grooming teenagers, but recruiting adults to participate in abuse that was already prepared and filmed. The leap from fantasy to action was not rare, it was facilitated. quirky tidbit, Coco, FR, at its peak, was one of the most visited chat sites in France, often ranked above dating platforms. Many users logged in for innocent reasons: chatting, flirting, boredom. The same platform that helped lonely pensioners swap recipes also hosted a channel where Dominique recruited accomplices. That duality still unsettles investigators. How one corner of the internet can feel harmless while another turns into a predator's marketplace. The anonymity of the forum made it possible. Behind usernames like Loop13 or Voyageur Sud, men could roleplay without fear. And yet, Dominique was different. He turned anonymity into coordination. He left addresses, times, even instructions about how to approach the house quietly. Prosecutors would later argue that this wasn't just abuse. It was logistics, an organized ring with a ringleader. Investigators still question whether CocoFar moderators ever noticed. Did they see the chat rooms devoted to incapacitation and simply shrug them off as role play? Did they ignore the possibility that someone might be acting it out in real life? By 2025, even the site's founder, Isaac Steidl, faced charges for complicity in an organized gang, accused of running a platform that knowingly sheltered criminal exchanges. That ongoing legal battle is itself a referendum on internet accountability. For the men who responded, excuses varied. Some claimed they thought Giselle was a willing partner role-playing sleep. Others admitted they didn't care, so long as they could satisfy a forbidden fantasy. The line between delusion and criminal intent blurred. What united them was access, and Dominique gave them that access. He was the gatekeeper, the recruiter, the archivist. His network was not dozens of men meeting each other, it was dozens of men orbiting one husband's betrayal. The shock for investigators was not only the number, 72 men, but their diversity. The network included truck drivers, teachers, retirees, even a police officer. No single social class, no neat profile of a predator. Instead, the Pellicott case revealed how ordinary men, under the right conditions of secrecy and invitation, could step across the line into monstrous acts. As news spread, France erupted in debate. Was this a failure of technology, of law enforcement, or of culture itself? How could a forum named Without Her Knowledge exist in the open web without scrutiny? Commentators compared it to the darknet Silk Road of the 2010s, except here no Tor browser was needed. You just needed a free login and a willingness to scroll. You sit with the chill of that thought, that evil can recruit in broad daylight, using the same tools we use to chat with friends. And you realize that the Pellicott case is not just about one marriage in Mazan. It is about the ease with which predators organize, the normalization of fantasy spaces online, and the catastrophic consequences when one man decides to make fantasy real. You imagine the detectives, hunched over a workstation, the fluorescent hum of the police lab above them. They slot Dominique Pellicot's seized hard drive into the computer, expecting maybe some voyeuristic supermarket shots, grainy, pathetic attempts at upskirt images. What they actually find feels like stumbling into a vault of horror. Hundreds of gigabytes, carefully named folders, dates, times, men, and always the same victim. Giselle, his wife, motionless in bed, her body treated like contraband. The sheer meticulousness is what shocks you first. Dominique wasn't sloppy. He cataloged almost everything. Some files bore timestamps stretching back to 2011. Others were labeled with usernames, aliases of the men who had come through his home. It read less like pornography and more like accounting, a ledger of organized abuse. Investigators later said the structure reminded them of a library, a sick archive of violation kept for private review. Historically, cases have often turned on records. Think of the Green River Killer in the United States, tracked through his careful collection of victims' mementos. Dominique's archive, too, became the nail in his own coffin. Once those folders were opened, no jury in France could pretend the scale was exaggerated. It was all there, pixel by pixel, too detailed to deny. Investigators still question whether Dominique wanted to be caught. Why else record everything with such precision? Some criminologists argue that archivists of crime often battle a double urge: the desire to relive control and the unconscious craving to prove they accomplished what fantasy alone could not. Others believe Dominique genuinely thought he could keep the evidence forever hidden, his home life so ordinary that no one would dare pry. A strange detail surfaced in those drives. Dominique occasionally used antique cameras to photograph the scenes, even though video technology was easier. It was as if he wanted a tactile memento, something he could hold, frame, or even mislabel as art. That quirk, part nostalgia, part pathology, helped prosecutors illustrate how deliberate his actions were. This wasn't an impulsive man, this was someone who curated abuse like a collector. The drives contained more than videos, chat transcripts, maps, even handwritten notes scanned into PDFs. He kept logs of which men had visited, how long they stayed, and sometimes comments about their performance. Cold, detached, managerial, like he was running a grotesque guest book. Reading those files, officers described the sensation of peering into the bureaucracy of crime, a paperwork system where his wife was reduced to a passive entry line. For Giselle, being shown the archive was a second violation. She had no memory of what happened, but now she had to process evidence that spoke louder than her own mind. Victim advocates compared it to forced witnessing, watching yourself in crimes you never experienced consciously. The archive wasn't just proof for the court. It was trauma made permanent, impossible to erase. The hard drive also became the linchpin for connecting the wider network. Through IP addresses, usernames, and cross-referenced schedules, investigators identified dozens of men. Some were shocked when police came knocking. Others seemed resigned, even indifferent. The drive didn't just incriminate Dominique, it mapped the ecosystem of his accomplices. Quirky tidbit. One folder was mislabeled Vacancies, Vacation. Investigators clicked, expecting family photos. Instead, more recordings. That eerie misdirection became infamous in French media, the chilling reminder that behind every ordinary label might lurk something sinister. People joked nervously about renaming their own folders, but the unease stuck. A vacation folder as archive of organized rape. It was the banality of evil in keystrokes. The existence of the files also forced France into a debate about digital permanence. Should such material be destroyed once trials are over? Should it be preserved as evidence of atrocity, like war crime archives? Investigators still question whether erasing it would be mercy or negligence. For now, the files are sealed, stored under the highest protections, simultaneously a tool of justice and a scar on memory. You think again of that moment, the hum of a police lab, a click of a mouse, a folder opening. History sometimes pivots on such clicks, and for France, that hard drive turned a supermarket arrest into a national reckoning. The digital archive became both the prosecution S. sledgehammer and Giselle S. unchosen diary, a reminder that crimes unremembered still leave records and that secrets eventually find ways to surface. You let the number sink in. 72. Not 2, not 12, but 72 separate men who passed through the Pellicot household, each connected by one man's betrayal and one woman's unconscious body. The scale alone transforms the case from a story of domestic abuse into something France hadn't seen in generations. An organized network of men, drawn together not by chance but by invitation. At trial, prosecutors described it like a revolving door. Dominique posted on Coco. FR, men replied, and the house in Mazan became their meeting point. Some drove in from nearby villages, others from across the Rhone Valley, even from hundreds of kilometers away. They arrived at different times, sometimes one at a time, sometimes overlapping. Dominique played host, letting them in, leading them upstairs, ensuring Giselle was sedated. Then he filmed, or sometimes simply watched. The question that haunts you is, how did 72 men decide to cross that line? They were not stereotypical predators in trench coats. The accused included a schoolteacher, a retiree, a delivery driver, a soldier, even a police officer. The ordinariness was chilling. They were men who could be your neighbors, your colleagues, men who bought bread at the same bakery as you. Investigators still question whether they all knew the truth, that Giselle was unconscious, incapable of consent, or whether some chose deliberate ignorance to protect their fantasy. Historically, France has seen cases of collective abuse before, though rarely on this scale. In the 1990s, the Outreau affair rocked the courts, though that case collapsed under false testimony and judicial mishandling. The Pellicot case, in contrast, had indisputable video evidence. No retractions, no, he said, she said. Just a catalog of men, faces captured by Dominique's own camera. This wasn't rumor, it was record. A quirky detail emerged during trial. One man allegedly left a note in the Pellicot home thanking Dominique for hospitality, a grotesque echo of a guest book entry at a bed and breakfast. That scrap of paper became a symbol in media coverage, proof of how normalized the abuse became within the group. Ordinary politeness warped into complicity. Many of the men claimed later that they thought it was consensual role play. That defense collapsed once prosecutors played the footage. No safe words, no movement, no acknowledgement from Giselle. Just silence. For the court, that silence was damning. But outside, it raised an uncomfortable societal question. How many of those men truly believed in the role-play illusion, and how many simply didn't care? In interviews, victim advocates pointed to a darker truth, that online spaces like Coco far create moral bubbles where participants convince themselves their fantasies are harmless until someone offers them an outlet. Dominique's invitations provided that outlet. He gave them permission, and permission was all they needed to cross into crime. The 72 became less a random group and more a collective symptom of a culture that trivialized women's autonomy. The sheer number also strained the justice system. 51 men were ultimately indicted and tried. Some had disappeared, some could not be identified from the tapes, others were deceased. Still, it was one of the largest mass sexual assault prosecutions in French history. Courtrooms overflowed with lawyers, interpreters, psychologists. Reporters described it as a second city of defendants, each face representing one thread in Dominique's sprawling web. Investigators still question whether all 72 should be labeled equally. Was the man who entered once, briefly, as culpable as the man who returned repeatedly? Should the one who claimed ignorance receive the same sentence as the one who openly bragged online? The law tried to parse degrees of guilt, but public outrage painted them all with one brush. To most, 72 was 72 too many. And Giselle, what did it mean for her to learn that 72 strangers had walked through her home, touched her body, stolen years without her knowing? The scale amplified her isolation. She wasn't betrayed just by her husband, but by dozens of anonymous men, some still walking free in society, some still blending into crowds. Her victimhood became communal, spread across a lattice of strangers. A number is just a number until you feel its weight. 72 is not statistics. It's 72 choices, 72 men who crossed thresholds, 72 moments where someone could have said no, but didn't. And as France grappled with that, the Pellicot case became not just a scandal of one marriage, but a referendum on complicity itself. You picture the courtroom hushed, the air thick with expectation, when Giselle Pellicot finally takes the stand. For years, she had been spoken about rather than spoken to. Judges, lawyers, journalists, psychologists, all had debated her fate, her body, her silence. But in 2024, during the trial in Avignon, she found her voice. Her testimony was brief, fractured by pauses, but unforgettable. She described her life with Dominique not as a marriage, but as captivity cloaked in routine. He was charming to outsiders, a fixture in the neighborhood, the man who waved from his garden wall. Behind closed doors, he mixed pills into her wine, ground tranquilizers into her food, and whispered reassurances that blurred into commands. The betrayal cut deepest not because strangers had touched her, but because the man she trusted most orchestrated it. She told the court, "I didn't know my body wasn't mine anymore." Those words echoed in headlines across France, distilled into a single phrase that captured the heart of the scandal. For years, Giselle said, she lived in confusion. She remembered waking with aches she couldn't explain, feeling foggy, losing chunks of time. At first, she blamed stress, menopause, depression, excuses whispered by her husband himself. Dominique told her she was fragile, unwell, that medication was necessary. It wasn't until the police sat across from her in 2020, showing her what they had found on Dominique's hard drive, that the fog shattered into clarity. How do you process a crime you didn't know was happening to you? For Giselle, there was no gradual realization, no dawning suspicion. It was instant devastation. A detective recalled that she wept uncontrollably, repeating the same question. How long? Her answer came in fragments during testimony. Nearly a decade of abuse, 72 men, hundreds of hours of footage. The arithmetic of her stolen years felt incomprehensible. The court listened as she described the psychological toll, shame for not having known, guilt for having been absent from her own life, rage at her husband, terror of strangers. She admitted she struggled to look at her adult children, fearing the legacy of their father's crimes would stain them too. And yet, within that pain, she spoke with remarkable clarity about her survival. "I refuse to let him have the last word," she said, her voice shaking but steady enough to carry across the silent courtroom. For many watching, that moment transformed the trial. Until then, the proceedings had felt abstract. Files, statistics, blurred faces on screens. When Giselle spoke, the case became human. It wasn't tea about numbers anymore. It was about a woman reclaiming her voice after being silenced for years. Victim advocates praised her courage, noting how rare it is for survivors of such invasive abuse to testify directly, especially against so many defendants. Her words, though simple, carried the weight of an entire nation's outrage. She reminded the court and the public that at the center of this sprawling scandal wasn't a monster or 72 accomplices or even a website. It was her. Outside the courthouse, supporters left flowers, letters, and handwritten notes on the steps, many addressed simply, "For Giselle." In the French press, she was called La Femme Invisible, the invisible woman who was finally seen. Her testimony did not erase what had happened. It did not heal overnight wounds that stretched across years, but it shifted the story. From then on, whenever the Pellicot case was invoked, it wasn't only about Dominique or the men. It was about Giselle, the woman who survived and who spoke when silence had been forced upon her for too long. You imagine Mazan, the sleepy Provençal town with vineyards and lavender fields stretching beneath the sun, suddenly becoming the epicenter of one of France's darkest modern scandals. Until 2020, it was the kind of place that tourists pass through with a sigh of contentment, pausing for a glass of rosé or a stroll past medieval walls. But after Dominique Pellicot's arrest in a supermarket parking lot, the town's name became shorthand for betrayal, complicity, and organized abuse. Residents of Mazan, blindsided by the revelations, spoke in disbelief. Dominique had seemed so ordinary. Neighbors recalled barbecues, quick conversations about the weather, small favors exchanged across fences. No one guessed that in his modest home, behind a shuttered window, a quiet horror was unfolding. When news broke, Mazan became a magnet for satellite vans, reporters, and angry whispers. Parents pulled their children close on the street. Shopkeepers lowered their voices when gossip spilled. The move from Mazan to Avignon was not just geographical. It symbolized the case's transformation. from a local shock to a national reckoning. Avignon, with its papal palace and crowded courts, was chosen to handle the sheer scale of the trial. 51 defendants required space, security, and symbolism. The ancient city of bridges and walls became the stage for a story about how fragile those walls of trust can be. Journalists from Paris, Lyon, Marseille, even Brussels descended on Avignon. The coverage was relentless. Front-page spreads, radio debates, late-night television dissections. The words Pellicot case were suddenly on everyone's lips. Politicians weighed in too, framing it as a test of France's legal system. Could it confront not just an individual predator, but an entire network? History has a way of repeating itself in echoes, and observers noted parallels with earlier French scandals involving clergy, educators, and organized rings that had flourished in silence. Mazarin's quiet betrayal was part of that continuum. Investigators still question whether the Pellicot case was an anomaly, or simply the one that finally broke through to public consciousness. Among Avignon's locals, reactions were divided. Some resented their city becoming synonymous with abuse and scandal. Others embraced the idea of hosting the trial as a duty, a necessary confrontation with hard truths. Cafes near the courthouse filled with speculation, reporters scribbling notes as residents traded rumors about sentencing, evidence, and Giselle's fragile but courageous testimony. The transition also reflected the shifting balance of power. In Mazarin, Dominique had once controlled the narrative, outwardly genial, inwardly manipulative. In Avignon, the courtroom stripped him of that control. He sat among dozens of other men, no longer exceptional, just one figure in a chain of exploitation. The contrast was stark, and yet the town of Mazarin could not quite let go of its association. Even as Avignon carried the weight of the trial, Mazarin's residents struggled with collective shame. Teachers reported children asking if their town was bad. Tour guides winced when foreign visitors asked if they had heard of Dominique Pellicot. The scandal had shifted, grown larger, more public, but its roots remained in that quiet Provençal village. From Mazarin to Avignon, the story was no longer about a hidden crime. It was about a nation forced to reckon with how easily evil can hide in plain sight, and how quickly a familiar name can turn into a headline of horror. You picture the Palais de Justice in Avignon, the 19th century courthouse whose echoing halls suddenly feel too narrow, too fragile to contain the weight of the Pellicot case. It is early February 2024 when proceedings begin, and from the very first day, you sense history pressing in. 51 defendants, dozens of lawyers, a courtroom packed with journalists and observers. The sheer logistics resemble a theatrical production more than a trial. And yet, this is no play. It is a reckoning. The case is unprecedented in scope. Organized sexual abuse facilitated by a husband, Dominique Pellicot, against his unsuspecting wife, Giselle, over nearly a decade. The court has to grapple not only with Dominique's betrayal, but with the dozens of men he allegedly invited into his home. Some defendants face charges of rape, others of complicity, and a few with failure to report. To manage this tangled web, judges structure the trial almost like a military campaign. Daily schedules, rotating testimony, and strict limitations on media inside the room. Still, the public's hunger for details grows with each passing day. You imagine the defendants lined up in the dock, young, middle-aged, elderly, some in suits, some in plain sweaters. They do not look like villains from a film, and that perhaps is what disturbs people most. Ordinary men, caught in extraordinary crimes. Investigators still question whether all of them fully understood the extent of the abuse, or if some convinced themselves that Giselle was complicit. The court, however, made one thing clear. Ignorance would not excuse harm. Dominique himself sits separately, his face unreadable, a man both central and diminished. For years, he was the architect, the controller, the man who built an online form of predators around his wife's vulnerability. Now, reduced to a defendant, He listens as witnesses describe him not as a husband, but as a trafficker of his own partner. The prosecution builds its case meticulously. They project excerpts of the hard drive footage onto courtroom screens, though only the judges view the most graphic material to protect Giselle's dignity. For others, descriptions suffice. Her unconscious body, men moving around her, Dominique adjusting a camera. Reporters describe silence so thick it feels like a physical weight. Then comes Giselle's testimony, already heard, but here repeated within the larger choreography of the trial. Her voice cracks but does not break. She reminds the court, "I was not there. I was drugged. You saw me, but I was not present." The words crystallize the horror. A woman erased from her own life. Defense lawyers scramble, some arguing their clients thought the encounters were consensual, others questioning whether the scale of the alleged network was exaggerated. But each attempt falters against the sheer mountain of evidence. Hundreds of videos, online messages, Dominique's own confessions and chat logs. A few defendants openly weep, claiming regret. One mutters, "I thought she knew." The judge interrupts sharply. "You thought, or you chose not to know." Outside the courthouse, protests gather daily. Victims' rights groups wave banners, chanting for harsher penalties. Local parents arrive with strollers declaring they are there for Giselle. French media frames the trial as a turning point, the largest case of organized abuse against a single victim ever seen in the country. Comparisons are drawn with earlier scandals involving schools and clergy, but commentators stress that this one strikes even closer to home. It is not an institution. It is a marriage. In a strange twist, Cocofar, the website that allegedly hosted many of Dominique's predator contacts, becomes a kind of phantom defendant. Though not officially on trial in Avignon, its name recurs again and again. How could such forums operate unchecked? How could thousands of users discuss crime so openly without detection? The presiding judge promises to forward findings to digital regulators, but the anger in the room is palpable. And then there is the atmosphere. Part outrage, part exhaustion. Court clerks shuffle thousands of pages of testimony. Translators assist for non-French defendants. At times, the room feels more like a factory of grief than a place of justice. Yet, in that factory, a nation forges its resolve. By the end of February, as the trial edges toward verdicts, France is watching. From Paris cafes to Marseille docks, the name Pellicot has become shorthand for betrayal and complicity. Families discuss it at dinner tables, teachers in classrooms, politicians in interviews. The small-town scandal has grown into a mirror held up to an entire country. You lean back, absorbing the scene. The defendants, the lawyers, the victim, the public, it is all there, contained in one historic trial. The truth has finally emerged from Mazan's quiet streets into Avignon's roaring courthouse, and France knows it will never forget the sound of Giselle Pellicot's voice echoing through those marble halls. You picture the moment when the presiding judge returns to the bench, verdict papers stacked like bricks of consequence. The courtroom in Avignon stills, even the air seems to pause. It is late February 2024. Weeks of testimony behind, months of preparation gone. And now the words that will define justice for Giselle Pellicot are ready to fall. The sentences are read one by one. Dominique Pellicot, the husband at the center, receives 20 years in prison, convicted of drugging, rape, and organized abuse. The gavel of justice strikes hardest at him, and yet the ripple spreads outward. 40 of the other men receive varying punishments, prison terms from 2 to 15 years, some suspended sentences, others heavy fines. A handful are acquitted for lack of sufficient evidence, though even those men leave the courthouse marked by association. The reactions are immediate, conflicting, raw. For survivor advocates, the 20-year sentence feels too light. He stole a decade of her life, one says outside, her voice trembling with rage. Others see it as a triumph. an organized ring, once hidden, dismantled in broad daylight. Families of convicted men weep in the corridors, clutching lawyers' arms, insisting their sons or fathers were misled, entrapped, manipulated by Dominique. The French press reacts with a wave of headlines. "Justice in Avignon," declares Le Monde. "Too little for too much," counters Libération. Television talk shows erupt with debates over sentencing guidelines. Should complicity carry the same weight as direct participation? Should ignorance ever mitigate guilt? Investigators still question whether the French system is built to handle crimes that straddle both personal betrayal and collective responsibility. And then there is the town of Mazan. In cafes, residents mutter about how they will forever be linked to this case. One shopkeeper tells a reporter, "When people hear Mazan now, they don't think of vineyards, they think of monsters." Yet others argue that the trial should not stain the whole town, but instead serve as a warning that even in the sunniest places, shadows can stretch long. A historical fact surfaces in commentary. Not since the Outreau affair in the early 2000s had France seen such a sprawling trial for sexual abuse. That case had collapsed under contradictions and judicial missteps, leaving scars of wrongful convictions. In contrast, the Pellicot trial is upheld as a model of caution and thoroughness, even if it cannot satisfy every cry for harsher punishment. In a fringe detail that catches headlines, one convicted man reportedly left the courthouse muttering about justice being theater. The phrase circulates online, where it is twisted into memes and angry rebuttals. For many, the only theater was his denial, the refusal to accept that the stage was never about performance, but about truth. Public anger lingers. Demonstrations flare in Avignon, Paris, Lyon, placards demanding longer sentences, stricter digital policing, better victim protections. Yet among the noise, one quieter voice resonates most: Giselle's. When asked by a reporter if she felt justice had been done, she simply replied, "It is not enough, but it is something. And I am still here." Those words travel further than any editorial. For victims across France, her survival and testimony carry more weight than any sentencing chart. They remind you that while courts can deliver numbers, only the survivor can deliver meaning. And so, the trial closes, sentences given, appeals promised, reactions divided. France exhales, but not with relief. More with the heavy knowledge that justice, even when delivered, cannot restore what was lost. It can only mark that it happened, and that the nation must not turn away again. You shift your gaze from the marble benches of Avignon ES courthouse to the glowing screens that dominate the modern world. Behind the Pellicot case lurks not just one man, not just 72 accomplices, but an infrastructure that allowed them to find each other. The website Coco. For Coco, FR at first glance looks innocuous. An online chat platform where strangers gather to exchange flirtations, jokes, or companionship. It is one of the largest in France, claiming millions of registered users. But investigators in 2020 discovered something darker. Within Coco's anonymous rooms, men connected, shared fantasies, and, most damningly, arranged encounters. For Dominique Pellicot, it became his hunting ground. He allegedly used it to boast about his drugging of Giselle, to post images, and to recruit men willing to visit Mazan. The trial in Avignon did not place Coco, FR itself, in the dock, but its shadow was everywhere. Prosecutors repeated its name until it became shorthand for complicity. Lawyers held up screenshots of exchanges. One man admitted, "Without Coco, I would never have met him." Another claimed he stumbled across Pellicot's posts by accident, insisting he had not realized the extent of what was happening. Investigators still question whether the site's moderators knew, or chose not to know, what flourished under their watch. Public reaction was furious. Newspapers ran exposés showing how easily underage users could access explicit rooms, how predators circulated unchecked. A senator in Paris called Coco Efir, a digital back alley where crime festers in plain sight. Activists demanded the site be shut down entirely. Coco's administrators, meanwhile, insisted they had rules, moderation, and disclaimers, comparing themselves to a phone company that cannot police every conversation. History adds a sobering echo. In the early 2000s, European lawmakers debated holding internet providers liable for crimes committed through their platforms, but the laws never kept pace with technology. By 2024, Coco FR had become a test case for those long-ignored fears. Could a website be blamed for what its users did? Or was that stretching justice too far? A quirky twist emerged when journalists discovered Coco. FR's name derived from a bird, the parrot, because conversations were meant to be light, playful chatter. The irony was bitter. A site meant for chatter instead became a stage for silence, where predators hid in anonymity. In Avignon, Giselle's lawyers did not mince words. Without Coco, this would not have happened at such scale. The judge promised to send recommendations to France's digital regulators, hinting that the era of platforms escaping scrutiny might be closing. Yet, as verdicts rolled in for the men, Coco FR continued to operate. Its homepage still active, its chat rooms still buzzing. Campaigners warned unless stronger regulation arrived, another Pelicot case could lurk just behind the next username. France wrestled with the paradox: freedom of expression online versus freedom from exploitation. And for many, the balance seemed painfully overdue for correction. So, while Dominique Pellicot carried his sentence to prison and his accomplices scattered into cells or probation, Coco FR remained on trial in the court of public opinion. Its future uncertain, its reputation shattered, its role undeniable. In the story of organized abuse, the internet was not the villain, but it was the stage, and the world now demanded the stagekeeper be held accountable. You imagine the nation catching its breath after the verdicts, thinking perhaps the story had finally reached its close. But then another ripple strikes the surface. A voice from within Dominique Pellicot's own family. His daughter. In the spring of 2024, French media reported that one of Dominique's adult daughters came forward with accusations. She claimed her father had abused her during her childhood, long before the Mazan scandal exploded. The statement, stark and devastating, suggested that Dominique's violence had not begun with Giselle. Instead, it may have stretched further back, hidden within the walls of his home for decades. The daughter's testimony was not part of the Avignon trial, but her words carried the same shattering weight. For prosecutors, it raised the prospect of new charges. For the public, it reframed Dominique not only as a husband who betrayed his wife, but as a father who betrayed his child. The betrayal seemed bottomless. Investigators still question whether his patterns of abuse were always there, waiting to erupt, or whether they escalated over time through opportunity and technology. The daughter's voice added layers to the story. If true, then the Pellicot case was not an isolated eruption of monstrous behavior, but the end point of a long trajectory. Childhood abuse hidden in secrecy, then adult abuse masked by drugs, cameras, and complicity. For some commentators, this detail tied Dominique to a darker archetype of predators, men who weave abuse into every relationship they can control. Legally, her accusations are subject to verification, statutes of limitation, evidentiary hurdles, and the already overwhelming Pellicot proceedings complicate the path forward. Still, the symbolic impact was immense. France saw not just a victimized wife, but the echo of harm reverberating across generations. Journalists noted how often such revelations surface only after high-profile trials, when survivors feel emboldened to speak. Historically, parallels were drawn to the Dutroux affair in Belgium in the 1990s, where initial revelations of child abuse later unearthed deeper horrors. Fringe theories swirled online, some speculating that Dominique's behavior might have been enabled by long-hidden networks, though no concrete evidence has surfaced to support that. For Giselle, the revelation struck painfully. Reports suggest she expressed sorrow, not surprise, at her daughter's statement. It seemed to confirm that the man she had once trusted was not just the architect of her own stolen years, but the destroyer of their children's innocence. That dual betrayal, the wife drugged, the daughter allegedly abused, made the Pellicotte name synonymous not just with organized crime, but with generational trauma. Outside courtrooms and newsrooms, the French public debated whether Dominique E.'s 20-year sentence now seemed insultingly small in light of these new claims. Parents whispered in Mazan, wondering if they had ever unknowingly let their children near him. Activists renewed their calls for a complete overhaul of abuse investigations, arguing that predators rarely stop with one victim. And yet, amid the storm, the daughter's voice shone with bravery. Like her mother, she stepped into the light of public scrutiny not for fame, not for money, but to tell the truth. She was determined, it seemed, to make sure no one could ever again say, "We didn't know." So, the Pellicotte case, thought closed in Avignon, widened once more. It was no longer just a scandal about one man's betrayal of his wife. It became a story of family fractures, of inherited wounds, of silence broken across generations. And you feel the unease settle in. This was never only about Mazan, or Coco, FR, or 72 Men. It was about what happens when secrecy takes root inside a home and grows, decade after decade, until the walls cannot contain it any longer. You linger in the silence that followed the trial, the headlines, and the daughter's accusations. France had watched every frame of the Pellicotte case, from supermarket arrest to the Avignon courtroom, and now the country stood in uneasy reflection. The story was no longer just about a husband's betrayal or 72 strangers. It had become a mirror, forcing an entire nation to confront questions about complicity, technology, and the fragility of trust. In Mazan, the little Provençal town that once seemed untouched by scandal, residents tried to reclaim their identity. Festivals continued, vineyards blossomed, tourists returned. Yet the shadow lingered. To say Mazan in 2024 was to invite a raised eyebrow, a knowing look. Some locals quietly called it le fardeau, the burden. The town had been unwillingly tied to the Pellicotte name, and there was no easy way to untangle it. Nationally, the outrage translated into action. Lawmakers debated tighter regulations on digital platforms, especially anonymous chat rooms like Coco. FAR. By autumn 2024, new proposals circulated in Parliament, calling for mandatory age verification and stricter moderation requirements. Some senators pushed for complete shutdowns of sites that could not control predatory content. Activists argued this was long overdue, citing the Pellicotte case as proof that the internet had become an unchecked playground for abusers. But beyond laws and policies, there was the human cost. Gisèle Pellicotte's quiet courage lingered most strongly in the public mind. Her testimony, her survival, her refusal to remain silent, all became symbols of resilience. Women's groups across France invoked her name at rallies, describing her not only as a victim, but as a survivor who had shifted the narrative. A quirky detail emerged months later. Someone in Avignon began leaving white roses on the courthouse steps every Friday. No one claimed responsibility, but locals began to interpret it as a ritual of remembrance for Gisèle. In time, others joined, until the steps bloomed weekly with flowers, silent but insistent. And still, investigators question whether justice can ever be considered done in such a case. 20 years in prison cannot erase a decade of drugging. Hundreds of hours of footage cannot be unmade. A daughter's childhood cannot be restored. What remains is testimony, accountability, and memory. Tools for prevention, but never instruments of repair. France has been here before, wrestling with scandals that shook its conscience. The Outreau affair, the Dutroux echoes from across the border. The countless institutional cover-ups slowly dragged into the light. The Pellicotte case joins that lineage. A grim reminder that abuse thrives not only in dark corridors of power but also in ordinary homes, behind shutters and smiles. And you, listening now, are left with the unease of that truth. Evil rarely announces itself. It often looks ordinary, even banal. It hides in routine, in silence, in complicity. The outrage over Mazan and Avignon may fade in headlines, but the lesson remains. Vigilance is not just a duty of courts and lawmakers, but of communities, neighbors, and families. In the end, the Pellico case is not only about Dominique or Giselle or Coco. For sure, it is about what a society chooses to see and what it refuses to ignore. It is about finding the courage to believe victims, to confront discomfort, and to demand accountability from both individuals and systems. And it is about remembering that silence, left unchecked, can become the greatest accomplice of all. And now, as we drift away from Mazan's cobblestones and Avignon's courtrooms, let the echoes soften. The Pellicot case has been heavy, weighted with betrayal, secrecy, and outrage. But you have walked through it, calmly, listening, reflecting, bearing witness. That is what matters, because telling these stories means they are not forgotten. Take a slow breath. Let it sink in that amid horror there was also resilience. Giselle spoke, even when silence seemed easier. Her daughter spoke, even when memory hurt. And their words reached across France, reminding us that truth cannot stay buried forever. The nation, too, spoke, through its outrage, its protests, its demands for reform. History shows us that change comes slowly, unevenly, but it begins with the courage of individuals willing to break the silence. That is the thread you carry with you now. The reminder that vigilance starts small, in homes, in towns, in everyday choices to listen and believe. So, close your eyes if you like. Picture Avignon at dusk, the courthouse glowing under warm lights, the weekly roses blooming on its steps. Somewhere, someone is whispering their story for the first time. Somewhere else, someone is deciding to listen. That is how healing begins. Thank you for spending these hours with me on 102 Hours. If this story moved you, remember to like, subscribe, and share your own reflections in the comments. Maybe tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I'd love to know. Until next time, rest gently and carry the quiet strength of survivors with you into your dreams.